After the division of Vietnam following the Geneva Accords, tensions escalated between the communist-controlled North Vietnam and the anti-communist government in South Vietnam. The promised election to unify the country never took place. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Communist Viet Cong insurgency, supported by North Vietnam, intensified its guerrilla warfare against the South Vietnamese government. The United States became increasingly involved in supporting South Vietnam, providing military assistance and advisors to help combat the Viet Cong. The situation in Vietnam escalated into a full-scale conflict in 1964 when the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, in which North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked American naval vessels. This event led to the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, became a protracted and divisive conflict. The United States, along with its allies, engaged in a massive military campaign to support South Vietnam against the communist forces of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. The war involved conventional warfare, aerial bombings, chemical warfare, most notoriously the widespread use of Agent Orange, and ground combat. Despite the vast resources and manpower committed to the war effort, the conflict proved to be a quagmire for the United States. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army employed guerrilla tactics and received support from neighboring communist countries like the Soviet Union and China. The war took a heavy toll on both Vietnamese civilians and American troops, leading to widespread opposition and protests in the United States. The anti-war movement gained momentum throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, fueled by growing disillusionment with the war's human cost and perceived lack of progress. Protests, demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience became widespread, challenging the legitimacy of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The conflict finally came to an end in 1975 when North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, leading to the reunification of the country under communist rule. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of a new era for Vietnam. The period following the overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam marked a tumultuous phase in the country's history, coinciding with the escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited the Vietnam dilemma and faced mounting challenges in the region. The Viet Cong insurgency continued to gain ground in South Vietnam, despite American military assistance. Johnson, like his predecessors, was committed to preventing the spread of communism and maintaining South Vietnam as a non-communist ally in Southeast Asia. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 provided a pretext for increased U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. Following the incident, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting Johnson broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. With increasing U.S. military presence, the conflict in Vietnam intensified. American troop levels surged, and extensive bombing campaigns were conducted against North Vietnam. The U.S. military strategy focused on conventional warfare and search and destroy missions aimed at rooting out Viet Cong insurgents. Despite significant military efforts and resources, the Vietnam War proved to be a protracted and costly conflict. The rugged terrain, guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Cong, and the commitment of North Vietnam's communist forces made it challenging for the United States and its allies to achieve decisive victories. The war became increasingly unpopular, both domestically and internationally. In the United States, opposition to the war grew, fueled by anti-war protests, draft resistance, and the growing human cost of the conflict. The anti-war movement became a significant social and political force, contributing to Johnson's decision not to seek re-election in 1968. Johnson's successor, President Richard Nixon pursued a policy of Vietnamization, gradually reducing U.S. troop levels while increasing support for the South Vietnamese military to take on a greater role in the conflict. Additionally, Nixon initiated diplomatic efforts to negotiate a peace settlement with North Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 eventually led to a ceasefire and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. However, fighting between North and South Vietnam continued, ultimately culminating in the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The Vietnam War had far-reaching consequences, shaping U.S. foreign policy, altering domestic politics, and leaving a lasting impact on Vietnamese society. It remains one of the most divisive and controversial episodes in American history. President Johnson's decision to escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam through Operation Rolling Thunder marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War. Operation Rolling Thunder was a sustained aerial bombing campaign against North Vietnam, aimed at weakening the North Vietnamese government's resolve and ability to support the Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam. The campaign involved extensive bombing of strategic targets, including military installations, transportation networks, and industrial facilities. Johnson's authorization of Operation Rolling Thunder reflected his administration's belief that a show of overwhelming force could compel North Vietnam to negotiate an end to the conflict on terms favorable to the United States and its allies in South Vietnam. However, the bombing campaign failed to achieve its intended objectives and instead led to unintended consequences. Despite the relentless bombing raids, North Vietnam's communist leadership remained resolute, and the North Vietnamese military adapted to the aerial assaults by dispersing their forces and employing guerrilla tactics. Moreover, Operation Rolling Thunder intensified anti-American sentiment in North Vietnam and fueled support for the communist cause, both domestically and internationally. The escalation of the air campaign also escalated the human cost of the war. Civilian casualties mounted, and the destruction caused widespread suffering among the Vietnamese population. Additionally, the bombing campaign strained relations between the United States and its allies, sparking protests and condemnation from countries around the world. Operation Rolling Thunder failed to achieve its strategic objectives of forcing North Vietnam to capitulate or compelling the communist leadership to negotiate a settlement favorable to the United States and South Vietnam. Instead, it contributed to the further escalation of the conflict and deepened the United States' involvement in a protracted and increasingly unpopular war.